God kveld, velkommen til Tabloid. Han skyldig for antisemittisme, rasisme og for å ha fornektet holocaust. Han ble invitert til litteraturfestivalen på Lillehammer, men det førte til så mye bråk at invitasjonen ble trukket tilbake. Nå forbereder politiet seg på bråk og demonstrasjoner når David Irving ventet til Lillehammer i morgen. Men akkurat nå han her i Tabloid. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me here.
What is your reaction to the fact that the invitation you got from the festival at Lillehammer was withdrawn?
I was first of all very proud to receive the invitation. And then I was very insulted, not only that it was withdrawn so quickly, but the manner in which they withdrew it. They said, quite wrongly in my view, they said that they had invited me as an example of a liar. It was a very quick excuse on their part, I think. I think the one honourable thing that happened was that Stig Zetterberg, the man who was the cultural director of the festival, I think he resigned.
But he's the one who said that you're invited because you're a falsifier of history.
I don't think he said that. I think that the president of the festival finally said that at a press conference.
I've seen what he's written, and that's what he said.
Well, I don't know who he gets that from. I think the problem is that too few people in Norway have read my books. A lot of people in the rest of the world have read my books, and I think if more people read my books, they would see that I'm not the way that I'm described.
And a lot of people in the rest of the world say you are a falsifier.
Yes, and we know what their agenda is. They don't like the books I write because I write what I find actually happened. I write politically incorrect history. I think I write the kind of history that will stand up for 100 years, whereas most modern history is written for the day. You reach a point when you write history as a historian where you have a choice. Either you write books to make money, or you write books to, as Churchill said, the job of a historian is to find out what happened and why.
And that's what you're doing.
I try and find out what happened, and even if I don't like what happened, even I know my readers won't like what happened, I write it the way it was.
We'll come back to that in a moment. I just want your comment on the fact that your hotel reservations were cancelled too.
Yeah, it's nothing new. They can't debate me, and so they silence me. My opponents around the world have used methods to try and silence me, beginning in a campaign in about 1991. I started what I call my international campaign for real history, like real beer in England, the real ale campaign. And real history, I think, is the kind of history that you write straight from the archives into the books with no political input. And once that real history began to be published, with the new edition of my Hitler biography, for example, then behind the scenes this campaign started to silence me. And I've seen the evidence. I've seen the secret meetings of political groups and so on.
What kind of political groups?
Oh, the Holocaust Educational Trust in Britain. In November 1991, they had a secret meeting which was attended by a non-Jewish historian, David Fox, a very upright, respectable historian. And he was so angry when he heard them plotting to put pressure on my publisher, Macmillan, one of the biggest English publishers, that he resigned. He said, I'm not going to go along with this.
But has it crossed your mind that people are deeply offended by your allegations?
Yes.
They don't believe that you're telling the truth.
Yeah.
And to the people who lost their whole families in the concentration camps, what you're saying is preposterous.
A lot of people died in World War II, not just Jews, not just gypsies, not just homosexuals. A lot of ordinary Norwegians, Germans, Dutch and French and other countries, innocent people died. I think that the real crime in World War II wasn't genocide, it was killing of innocent people in what I call innocenticide. That was the real crime. And once you start limiting it just to one group of people and say, well, it's a crime when they did it to the Jews, but it wasn't a crime when it happened to the people in Hiroshima or Coventry or Dresden. That's where, as an Englishman, I say, no, I want to write level history, a level playing ground.
We have to finish this thing about Lillehammer before we go deeply into the subject.
Yes, I'm going there in a few days' time.
Yes, you decided to go anyway.
Yes.
So what are you going to do there?
Yes, I mean, people think they can silence me by saying, OK, we're not going to invite you. Norway is a free country. I can go if I want.
But it's also secret.
A lot of people wrote to me from Norway.
They did?
Saying, David Irving, we want to hear you speak. I don't know who they are, but they wrote and said, we really want to hear you speak. I've got a list of 50 or 60 names.
They might be neo-Nazis.
They might be. I hope they are. Because
why?
If they are...
Is it so good to be embraced by the neo-Nazis?
No, I don't want to be embraced by them, but I think having neo-Nazis in an audience is a good thing, because then I can then say, hey, fellas, you're slightly wrong here and you're right there. They need to be corrected in their views.
So they're slightly wrong?
They're a lot wrong in some respects, very, very clever. But
what are you going to speak? What are you going to speak about? When are you going to speak? Where are you going to speak in Lillehammer? It's also secret.
It has to be. I mean, you've seen today the reasons why I have to keep my movement secret. Even though I announced yesterday that I was already in Oslo, there was a big crowd of unpleasant people waiting for me at the airport today when I did arrive. So I have to be careful. I've suffered a lot of real violence from people who don't want me to speak.
So what are you going to speak about?
When I go to Lillehammer at the end of this week, I'm going to be speaking on one special aspect of history, which is the kind of history that you can write if you use just one category of documents. And these are the decoded documents. In Britain, we had the world's best decoding organization. We had 30,000 experts decoding German.
And you're going into all these, and you also found news about Norway.
Yes.
What is that?
You find things that set you back. You think, whoa, this isn't what I believed, because it's not the politically correct version of history. About Norway, for example, I wrote my very first or second book about the German atomic bomb project. Here in Norway, you had the only source of heavy water at Vemork, Norsk Hydro. And I wrote a book about the German atomic bomb project. Now, 44 years later, I'm reading the German messages decoded by the British, which reveal that 2 glider loads of British commandos landed, Operation Freshman. One glider crashed, the other glider went missing. The one that landed safely here in Norway, 20 commandos were rounded up by the Norwegian police. The Norwegian police turned these British commanders over to the Germans, and the Germans executed them all. It
is common knowledge that these people, these Englishmen, were killed by the Germans.
Yes.
But you're blaming this on the Norwegians.
Well, the wider lesson to be learned here is that just as in France, where the French liked to believe that they were a nation of resistors, and that the resistance in France is the most important thing that they did in World War II, if you read the German documents, you hardly notice the resistance. It didn't happen. And now the same in Norway. You find out that in Norway the Norwegians were a peace-loving people who were very happy once the hostilities had ended in 1940, and you lived a very peaceful war until 1945. And you were quite happy with the Germans here.
But are you saying the Norwegians
collaborated?
They collaborated to a large extent?
Yes. They collaborated to the degree that the Germans needed. Very, very few resistance cells in Norway. And the decoded messages make this case quite clearly.
That Norwegians collaborated?
The Norwegians collaborated with the Germans.
So you have the proof?
It's there in these tens of thousands of pages of decoded messages. The problem is the academics are far too important to do the groundwork of reading through these files.
But how am I going to believe this? Because you've been accused of tampering with evidence, of changing words. And there was even a lawsuit in England, which you lost, and the conclusion of that lawsuit was that you are a falsifier of history. Yes, so how am I going to believe that what you're saying about Norway is the truth?
I'm happy to rest on my record as an author. In England, my father used to say, British justice is the best that money can buy. And in the case you're referring to, which I fought in the year 2000 against an American academic who called me a Holocaust denier.
Yeah, and you lost. She was proven right.
She rounded up $13 million with which she bought the High Court in England.
She bought the court.
She bought the witnesses.
And you were innocent.
The witnesses were paid nearly £1 million each to give their opinion about David Irving. And so a witness says, well, yes, David Irving's a liar, he's a falsifier. Where's the cash, please?
But you lost.
Yes.
At the end, you lost.
Yes, but
because she had more money?
The records show I'm right. I'll give you one example. The judge said, David Irving said that 130,000 people were killed in the British air raid on Dresden. The real figure is 25,000, according to the judge. Now, in the decoded messages, only 2 weeks ago, in Britain, in the British archives, as I'm now reaching the end of reading the decoded messages, there's the decoded message from the police chief of Dresden, who reports to Berlin. He says, we have 100,000 missing in Dresden. So my figure was correct. So I'm quite happy to rest on my record.
You seem to be very infatuated by Hitler. Infatuated by Hitler, your real project.
Don't know the word.
Are you infatuated by him?
I would regard myself as his ambassador to posterity. If I can put it like this, the average journalist, and I think you went through a journalist school yourself, your editor will say when you're writing something nasty about David Irving, is he dead yet? If he's dead, then we can write what we want. My attitude as a historian is the opposite. If David Irving is dead, then we've got to be very careful what we write because he can't defend himself. And that's what I say about Adolf Hitler. So much has been written about Adolf Hitler since the end of World War II. that people think they can write what they want about him. I started from the beginning, with all the people who knew him, his private secretaries, his staff, the colonels, everybody who actually worked in the same room as him.
And your conclusion is that Hitler was very clever? I think you said that word.
I don't think he was a very clever person.
He was clever.
He was a brilliant strategist. He fought off the whole of the world, the entire armies of the world. He fought them off for 6 years, which is something George Bush didn't manage to do even in Iraq. So you have to, I mean, I think that at the end of the day, General Jodl, who was his chief strategist, was asked exactly the question, was Hitler a clever general? And Jodl says,
he was a clever general, but yeah. He's the worst, he's looked upon as the worst killer of the 20th century. And your project seems to be to rehabilitate him.
Not to rehabilitate, but to stone clean him.
Stone clean?
There's a subtle difference. It's not whitewashing, it's stone cleaning. So much muck has been thrown at the name of Adolf Hitler that I come along with my bucket and sponge and I want to see what actually happened. Okay, he was a criminal. His private secretary, Christa Schroeder, said, Mr. Irving, he could be very cruel. And she gave me some certain examples. Another person who was with Himmler, with Hitler's, he said, I remember when Himmler came into the room, the chief of the SS, and Hitler sat on the edge of the table and saying, yes, liquidate the prisoners in Buchenwald. Don't let them fall into the American hands. So I won the trust of Hitler's staff when I wrote my biography. And
you won the trust of Hitler's staff?
Yes, they trusted me with their private papers and diaries and with what actually happened.
Yes, and you've said that Hitler ordained you to write his biography.
Yes.
How could he?
He didn't actually say David Irving, but what he said to his doctor at the beginning of September 1944, and the doctor wrote it down in his diary, which he gave me. He said, you know, since 1942, I've had all my conferences taken down in shorthand. And perhaps one day a British historian will come along and write my biography. But he can't be a modern historian. He's going to have to be a historian of the next generation, and one who speaks fluent German, and one who's familiar with all the country's archives.
And that was
so when I telephoned this doctor and I said,
was a prophecy then.
I said, Dr. Giesinger, can I come and interview you? I'm writing a biography of Hitler. He said, Herr Irving, I have been expecting you. Of course, my rivals hate this because it didn't happen to them.
Did Hitler have a plan to exterminate the Jews?
I don't think so. He repeatedly, when we look at original documents, genuine documents, we see Hitler stretching out his hand to stop nasty things happening to them. I'll give you one example. In April 1942, the chief of the German civil service visits the Minister of Justice. And afterwards, the Minister of Justice says, Dr. Lammers, the chief of the civil service, tells me that Hitler, the Führer, has repeatedly said he wants the final solution of the Jewish problem delayed until after the war is over.
Yeah. So what you're basically saying here is that Hitler is misunderstood. He was a clever man.
I love the words you use.
He was the Jews' best friend. He didn't know anything about the gas chambers. And all this, how likely is it that the man on the top didn't know anything about all these things?
Put it the other way around. There's no evidence that he did know. It's not quite the same thing. I'm quite happy if you come along now 10 years' time, if I'm still around, and you say, Mr. Irving, I found the document. Here, you're wrong. And I say, thank goodness at last the rat race is over and I can just watch TV in the evenings.
But there is no document. You've done just the same, because you say, I've looked through all the documents. I can't find any evidence that Hitler had a plan to exterminate the Jews.
So you couldn't hang him.
So that is the proof that he didn't know.
Well, in England, we've always had this principle that a man is innocent until proven guilty, even Adolf Hitler. And unfortunately, historians tend to forget that, and they say, oh, well, who needs proof? His name is Hitler, hang him.
But I mean, how likely?
If you're a historian, you've got to have better criteria.
If you didn't know anything about Hitler, you heard about him, but you were not a historian, and someone came along and said that this man on the top, he was not responsible for killing 6 million Jews, because he didn't know.
He was responsible because he was head of state. Constitutionally responsible. The buck stops here. But for me, if I'm writing a book about the rise and fall of the Third Reich, then Hitler was responsible. What the hell? But if I'm writing a book about Adolf Hitler, the man, and the evidence appears to point out to the fact that people were doing things in his name without him knowing, which is what I think happened, then you've got to find out and write it.
Do you have to get into the archives and say, there's not a single paper where it's written that Hitler was responsible, he knew, so the conclusion is that he didn't know. Of course he knew. He was a man on the top. He knew what the people under him were doing.
This is the Hollywood image of Hitler, the omnipotent, omniscient Adolf Hitler. And he wasn't. His breath smelt. His teeth were falling out. He was an unpleasant man in many ways. His staff adored him. But he wasn't the omnipotent, he wasn't the Hollywood Madison Avenue version of Hitler. I very soon found out when I began discussing him with his staff, all of whom were educated people, that there were two Hitlers. There was the Madison Avenue Hitler, the published edition of Hitler, and there was the real Hitler that these people had been working for.
You had a daughter.
Yeah.
Josephine.
I've had 5 daughters.
Yes, but let's talk about your eldest daughter, I believe, Josephine.
Poor Josephine, yes.
Yes.
God rest her soul.
What happened to her?
She was schizophrenic. Very, very sad. She suffered schizophrenia for 18 years from her teenage years, and then when she was aged about 35, she killed herself. And I know what you're going to say. You're going to say that under the Nazis, they would have liquidated her.
She would have been a medical misfit to the Nazis.
Yes.
And they would have liquidated.
Yes.
Yes.
And my opponents, when Josephine killed herself at the end of the funeral, my opponents sent a big wreath round. A big wreath of white lilies and white roses with a little card attached, saying she had it coming to her. Effectively, it was written in camouflage language. It was the actual words were truly a merciful death, which is merciful death. Gnadentod was the German code word for euthanasia.
But stonewashing, as you say, Hitler.
Yes.
Knowing that his theories and the practice was to kill people like your daughter, doesn't that hurt?
Even there, you've got to distance yourself from your own family tragedy. And an American, a few days ago, he sent me an extraordinary photograph of Adolf Hitler, which he had signed to a cripple. And this girl had sent Adolf Hitler a poem, which she had written, and it was a poem about her life as a cripple in Germany in 1937. And Hitler was so moved by this poem that he sent her one of his most magnificent photographs, personally signed by him to her by name.
So Hitler had feelings. What a surprise.
Unquestioned, yes. Yes, but you won't believe that if you read the books about Adolf Hitler by other authors. But you need to know the truth, because World War II was an appalling tragedy. That was the Holocaust. And to stop these things happening, you can't go into it with a political bent. You've got to try and find out what actually happened and why.
David Irving, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.